The sunlight beamed harshly over the gleaming windshields of luxury cars lined up like soldiers in a showroom, reflecting off polished metal and blinding any wandering eye that dared look too close. The automatic glass doors slid open with a hiss as Carl stepped inside, his boots echoing softly on the shiny white floor. He looked around, impressed yet focused, scanning the room filled with symbols of status and success. He wasn't here to dream, he was here to buy. A few employees in matching black suits floated around, either seated at their desks or chatting with customers. But Carl's eyes were locked on one car in particular, a sleek, obsidian black sports sedan that looked like it belonged in a billionaire's garage. The curves, the aggressive stance, the luxury badge on the grille, it called to him. Carl walked slowly toward it, admiring every detail. The leather interior, the carbon fiber trim, the precision of the design. He ran his hand along the side, feeling the coolness of the metal, the perfection of the finish. He could already imagine himself behind the wheel. He stepped back, adjusted his jacket, and turned toward the nearest sales consultant, a woman in her early 30s with blonde hair tied tightly into a bun. Her name tag reading Heather. She was finishing a conversation with a young couple and glanced over at him as he approached. Carl gave a polite smile and gestured toward the car. "Excuse me," he said. "Could you tell me more about this model? I'm really interested in it." Heather looked at him, her expression neutral for a second too long, her eyes scanning him as though trying to assess something invisible. Carl noticed the shift, how her posture subtly stiffened, how the polite smile she wore for the couple didn't quite reach her lips anymore. She walked over to him slowly, heels clicking. "That's one of our premium models," she said curtly. "Fully loaded, high-end performance, top of the line." Carl nodded. "That's exactly what I'm looking for. Can I test drive it? I've done my research, and this is the one I want." Heather's mouth tightened ever so slightly, and she folded her arms. "Are you serious about buying this car?" Carl blinked. "Yes," he said, a touch of confusion in his voice. "Why wouldn't I be?" Heather's eyes flicked toward the car and then back to Carl, and for a moment she seemed to hesitate like there was a battle happening in her mind, but then she took a half step back, her arms still crossed tightly across her chest, her expression cooling even further. "I'm sorry, sir," she said in a clipped tone, "but that car is not available for purchase." Carl furrowed his brow, confused. "What do you mean it's not available? I saw it online, it's on the lot, and you just told me it's one of your premium models. I'm ready to buy. What's the issue?" Heather shook her head slowly, like she was trying to communicate something without saying it directly, but Carl wasn't going to let it slide. "Look," he said, more firmly now, "I have the money. I came here prepared. I know exactly what I want. So what's the problem?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, and for a second her voice dropped to a colder register. "We don't sell vehicles like this. To people like you," she said quietly, almost like she hoped no one else would hear. Carl stared at her, a second of silence stretching between them like a rubber band pulled too tight. "People like me," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Heather sighed through her nose, clearly uncomfortable, clearly regretting her words, but unwilling to take them back. "You know what I mean," she said, not looking him in the eye anymore. "It's not up to me, it's company policy." Carl's face twisted in disbelief, his heart pounding as his blood began to boil. "Company policy?" he repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. "Are you seriously telling me you don't sell cars to black people?" Heather didn't answer. She simply shifted her weight, looking around nervously as if hoping someone would come and save her from the conversation. Carl took a step closer, not threatening, but clearly fed up. "Is that what this is? Because I'm black? That's your reason?" Still she said nothing. The silence was louder than any answer. Carl's fists clenched at his sides. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, shaking his head. "In this day and age, you think this is okay? Do you even hear yourself?" Heather didn't flinch. Instead, she turned her head slightly and raised a hand, motioning discreetly toward a tall man in a navy blue security uniform who stood by the showroom's side entrance. The security guard looked up, caught her signal, and began walking briskly toward them. Carl saw him coming and raised his voice. "Oh, now you're calling security? For what? Because I dared to ask a question? Because I'm asking why I'm not allowed to buy a car like anyone else." Heather took a step back, her voice now defensive and shaky. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. You're causing a disturbance." Carl laughed bitterly, though there was no humor in it. "I'm causing a disturbance? I'm the one being refused service for no reason. You're the one who made this about race, not me. All I did was walk in here, pick a car, and ask a question." The security guard arrived then, a big man with a stern face and mirrored sunglasses. "Sir, I need you to calm down," he said in a rehearsed monotone, already moving to stand between Carl and Heather. "You're making the staff uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable," Carl repeated, incredulous. "I didn't raise my voice until I got told I'm not welcome because of my skin color. If anyone should be uncomfortable, it should be her, for saying something so ignorant and racist." The guard didn't respond. He simply held out an arm and gestured toward the exit. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave, sir. This is unbelievable," Carl said, his voice shaking now with anger and humiliation. "You really gonna throw me out for wanting to buy a car?" Heather crossed her arms again, smug now, hiding behind the authority of the security guard like a coward. "You're not a good fit for our dealership," she said coldly. "Please leave." Carl looked around, hoping anyone would intervene, but the few other employees on the floor had turned away, pretending not to see. Their eyes locked on their screens or suddenly fascinated by paperwork. The customers, mostly white and well-dressed, were murmuring to each other, but no one said a word. He felt exposed, like every eye in the building was silently confirming that he didn't belong here. With the guard now gently, but firmly placing a hand on his arm, Carl knew he had no choice. "Fine," he muttered, turning toward the door. "But this isn't over." As he walked toward the exit, his back straight and his fists clenched, the anger burned in his chest like fire, mixing with a hollow kind of sadness. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about what it represented. Being judged, dismissed, humiliated, not because of anything he did, but because of who he was. The doors hissed open behind him again, and as Carl stepped out into the sunlight, the brightness felt different now. Not warm, not welcoming, just harsh and blinding. Carl walked slowly down the sidewalk, his thoughts spinning, each step feeling heavier than the last, his mind replaying the moment over and over again like a broken record he couldn't shut off. He couldn't believe what had just happened, couldn't wrap his head around how boldly it had gone down, how unashamed they had been in dismissing him purely because of his skin color. The anger was still there, yes, but it was mixed with something more painful, an exhaustion that came from always having to prove himself, to walk into rooms and justify his presence, to show that he belonged just as much as anyone else. The car, the dealership, the confrontation, none of it was just about money or metal or customer service anymore. It was about dignity. He stared at the ground, hands in his pockets, his breath shallow with frustration when a sleek black SUV pulled up alongside the curb and stopped. The window rolled down, and a man in a tailored suit with salt and pepper hair and a sharp, concerned expression leaned out. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice crisp but not unfriendly. "I saw you coming out of the dealership just now. You looked upset. Did something happen?" Carl looked over, still simmering, trying to gauge if this was another setup, another humiliation, but something in the man's tone felt genuine. "Yeah," Carl said finally, jaw tight. "Something happened." The man stepped out of the car and approached, his shoes clicking on the pavement, expensive watch gleaming under the sun. "I'm Richard Kingsley," he said, offering his hand. "I own that dealership." Carl stared at the outstretched hand for a second, then shook it reluctantly. "Carl." Richard nodded. "Would you mind telling me what happened in there?" Carl hesitated for a moment, then let out a short, bitter laugh. "They refused to sell me a car," he said flatly. "Said it wasn't available. When I asked why, they told me the dealership doesn't sell to people like me." Richard blinked. "People like you?" "Yeah," Carl said, his voice quiet but edged with fire. "Black people." Richard's expression changed instantly. What had been mild concern turned into open disbelief and then quickly hardened into anger. "Who told you that?" Carl gestured vaguely toward the building. "A sales consultant. Blonde. Name tag said Heather." Richard didn't hesitate. "Come with me." Carl followed as Richard turned sharply and strode back toward the dealership with purposeful steps. Carl wasn't sure what was about to happen, but he was too tired to question it. The automatic doors parted again as they entered, the same cold air hitting Carl's face, but this time it felt different. This time, he wasn't alone. Employees looked up as Richard walked in, some startled, some suddenly standing straighter. He marched across the showroom, ignoring greetings and curious looks, until he spotted Heather at her desk, her fingers tapping on her keyboard like nothing had happened. "Heather!" Richard barked, his voice echoing across the room like a crack of thunder. She looked up, confused, then alarmed when she saw who it was. "Mr. Kingsley, step over here." Now, she stood slowly, her face pale, eyes darting from Richard to Carl and back again. They stopped near the car that had started it all, its glossy black finish now bearing witness to a reckoning. "Carl tells me you refused to sell him this car," Richard said, his voice clipped and icy. Heather swallowed. I was just following standard protocol. Did you tell him we don't sell cars to black people?" The room went silent. Every employee within earshot had stopped what they were doing. Heather froze, her mouth opening and closing. I didn't mean it like that. It's just that." "Answer the question," Richard snapped. "Yes or no?" She looked down, her voice barely audible. "Yes." Richard stared at her like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You said that in my dealership to a customer." Heather looked up, now visibly trembling. "I didn't think it would be a big deal. Get out," Richard said coldly. "You're done here. Effective immediately." "Please, Mr. Kingsley, No. You don't get to come back from that. Clear your things. Security will escort you." Two security guards, the same one who had thrown Carl out and another who had just arrived, stood frozen for a moment until Richard gave them a nod. They moved to flank Heather, who began to protest, but quickly realized it was futile. Her voice dissolved into sobs as she gathered her things and disappeared behind the glass walls of the office. Richard turned back to Carl, his face still tight with anger, but now softened with regret. "Carl," he said, "I'm deeply sorry for what just happened. That kind of behavior is not only unacceptable, it's disgusting. I built this dealership on trust, respect, and inclusion. I clearly failed to ensure that those values were enforced. That's on me." Carl said nothing for a moment. He didn't want to be cynical, didn't want to assume this was just damage control, but there was sincerity in Richard's voice that couldn't be faked. "I appreciate you saying that," Carl said quietly. "I just wanted to buy a car." Richard nodded. "And you still can. In fact," he pulled a small device from his pocket and tapped rapidly on the screen. "I'm applying a 15% discount on the vehicle you wanted. It's yours if you still want it. No pressure." Carl blinked. "Seriously?" "Absolutely," Richard said. "And I'll personally oversee the rest of the process. We'll have you driving out of here today." Carl felt a flicker of something warm rise in his chest. Not quite joy, not quite relief, but something that reminded him he was still worth being treated with dignity. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." The next hour went by like a blur. Paperwork was signed. Keys were handed over. Photos were taken. Employees, now clearly shaken by the earlier scene, became overly helpful, falling over themselves to make sure Carl was comfortable. But he wasn't here for their approval. He was here for what he'd earned, what he'd deserved from the moment he walked through those doors. And finally, when everything was ready, Carl stepped into his new car, the engine humming like a satisfied beast, the leather seat cool and smooth under him. He looked over at Richard through the window and nodded. Richard nodded back. Carl pulled away from the curb, the afternoon sun gleaming across the windshield, and for the first time that day, he felt like he could breathe.